Hi, my name is Dr. Damian Cohall, Senior Pharmacologist at the University of the West Indies, Koval campus. Welcome to the Stone Age. My name is Damian Cohall. I am a senior lecturer in pharmacology in the Faculty of Medical Sciences, University of the West Indies, Koval campus. I'm also the Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Medical Sciences.
So can we call you the weed lecturer? How did you get into medical cannabis?
Well, I try as much as possible to, to be careful about the use of terminology, especially as it pertains to the cannabis plant. I try to steer away from colloquial terms like marijuana, weed, because, often so much in the news media, those are the terminologies which actually demark the negative, aspects of the use of a plant. I got involved in medical cannabis research because as a pharmacologist, I would have spent many years trying to validate the medicinal uses of Caribbean plants. Cannabis sativa, we can't claim it as one of our plants, but it's a plant that is very prolific within the Caribbean scene because it is used for sacramental purposes in the Rastafari religion. It is also used recreationally. And I know from my discipline within pharmacology that it has been explored as a medicine. Right? So cannabis, along with other medicinal plants, have always been an interest of mine in terms of the exploration of the medicinal components and properties. And I have identified medicinal compounds from other plants. And like cannabis, I thought that this was a terrific opportunity for not just the university, but regions within the world, especially Caribbean region, to explore as a potential economic benefit to the people who could then benefit from a local derived medicine from the cannabis plant. Right?
How long have you been studying cannabis?
I've been studying cannabis specifically, I would say, over 7 years. In terms of its medicinal benefits. Just to give you some background, where I studied my pharmacology, that department was once headed by Professor Manley West. And of course, Professor Manley West is the Caribbean renowned pharmacologist or scientist that led to the development of Canasol, Asmasol, and quite a few other products that came from cannabis. His research was remarkable, and it started off by him just observing persons using cannabis during nighttime to go fishing and how it improved or enhanced their vision. And from that came Canasol. And that was the same basic, or I guess primitive observations that I would have made about other plants. And I have crossed over looking at medical cannabis because the potential for the exploration of medical cannabis industry or pharmaceutical industry out of cannabis was so much more enriched compared to other plants. And of course, with all of the media sensationalism that has happened on cannabis, especially in the US through the CNN series, it just made sense that we in the Caribbean, we just had to be proactive about investigating cannabis, seeing that we have had this plant so long in the Caribbean, all the time from our ancestors who were brought from West Africa, and also the indentured laborers who came from Asia, China, right? It just seemed appropriate, and the time was right for us really to be proactive about investigating cannabis on a larger scale. So I'm very happy with some of the recent actions towards doing that within the Caribbean setting.
Mm-hmm. As a pharmacologist, what would you say is the difference between regular cannabis and medical cannabis?
So when we're talking about medical cannabis, we're speaking about specific cultivars or grades of cannabis that are identified as medical grade cannabis from cultivation, right, going all the way through to finalized product. In pharmacology, we differentiate a medicine from a drug by saying that a medicine could be one or more drugs which are given to produce a therapeutic effect. So it all aligns well with the intent So this is a grade of cannabis that is being developed to produce a product which will be given to produce a therapeutic effect, not a recreational effect, not any other effects, but specifically a therapeutic medicinal effect.
Okay, so we know that right now in Barbados there are 5 drugs on the formulary. They're synthetic, or are they derived from natural? And then can you explain to me, or could you tell me your opinion on which is better, synthetic or natural?
Good question. There are 5 products on formulary, right? A couple of these agents that have been added to formulary are synthetic, THC-based products, right? We also have a natural extract from cannabis, which is CDB oil, which is cannabidiol, right? Which is marketed as Epidiolex. Now, the synthetic products, these are synthetic THC products, as I mentioned. Now, the stark difference between the synthetic products and the actual natural extracted products is that the synthetic products tend to be more potent. More potent doesn't necessarily mean more therapeutically advanced, right? It means that there needs to be a certain level of safety as it pertains to dosing with synthetic products, which one would expect to practice more so than with an extracted product. So the extracted products are not as potent, and of course will not exacerbate the adverse effects associated with the synthetic products as much, just based on the fact that they are less potent than synthetics.
Okay, so you spoke about the CBD extracted product and then the THC in terms of synthetic. Why are they separate? What about the Entourage Effect? So in terms of that, where are you in terms of synthetic versus natural extracted use?
So, telling my views on that, as much as we're speaking about medicine, we also have to speak about the economics of medicine or the pharmaceutical industry. It is a well-known fact that most medicines are derived from natural sources, right? You start off by extracting, but again, most of our medicines are not only from natural sources, but specifically plant-based natural sources, which would mean that you will end up cultivating material for extraction. Chances are, that industry then will become unsustainable because, you may not be able to cultivate sufficient plant material to extract all the medicine you need from it. So within the pharmaceutical sciences, within the pharmaceutical industry itself, pharmaceutical companies thought that it was probably best to look at synthesizing these medicinal compounds that were initially extracted, right? Hence, you came up with synthetic products. So these are organic synthetic or inorganic synthetic medicinal compounds. The question about which is better then could be argued from the medical or therapeutic viewpoint, or it could be argued from the economic viewpoint. So economically, it is better to synthesize products because you can then ramp up commercial synthesis, which is useful in the cases of use of product to treat a condition that is widespread, right? As opposed to extracting medicine from a plant, which will require you to be cultivating more plant. And chances are you don't maximize the use of a plant because you're just extracting it for medicine, and then you end up with material or extracted material or residual material which cannot be used for any other purpose because you have been limited to the use of a plant for medicinal, right? Now, when you look at the use of the natural extracted products, and again, looking at the advantages of such, and again, focusing primarily on the therapeutic effects, you end up with less potent products than synthetics, right? There is also a great opportunity to foster or to engender what is now being derived of that as that entourage effect, because you're not only extracting one cannabinoid, but you may be extracting 2 cannabinoids, and the 2 primary cannabinoids of interest have always been THC, which is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, and the CBD, which is their cannabidiol. We are now seeing a lot of formulations which are actually a combination of both cannabinoids, right, THC, CBD, which are now proven to be quite effective in managing, a variety of conditions. One in particular is spasticity, which is associated with multiple sclerosis, right? Which is a 1-to-1 THC CBD ratio.
You touched on cannabinoid, the different components. Can you tell us roughly, because I know there are a lot, can you tell us approximately how many and what are some of the major ones where they're used for?
So, dependent on when and what source of information or where the source of the information is coming from on cannabinoid biochemistry or the biochemistry of the cannabis plant, you will hear a lot of numbers being thrown around about the number of cannabinoids. There are approximately 120 cannabinoids, right, in the cannabis plant. Most of the research, however, have focused on these two important cannabinoids, which are THC, delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol, and cannabidiol. THC initially because of the psychoactive effects that have been associated with the use of a plant within the recreational space. But now we're seeing emerging that THC, even though it is blasphemized so much for its recreational use and abuse, we're seeing where THC has very important medicinal value. All right. I think the US FDA found that out a long time ago, but the rest of the world was not observing that, right? Hence the synthetic THC-based products, nabilone and dronabinol. CBD being the next important cannabinoid, which is known as anti-inflammatory, as analgesic properties as well. Most importantly, the big anti-epileptic effects, right? We have had many stories about that, especially in the documentary series put forward by CNN with Charlotte, and how Charlotte had to move to, Colorado to get access to CDB medical products, so that her seizures could go down from roughly 300 to 5, on a week to monthly basis. So these two cannabinoids have essentially taken over in terms of the research and the scientific exploration to identify medicines compared to the other cannabinoids. But what does that mean for emerging industries in Barbados and Jamaica and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Antigua, is that there are 118 more cannabinoids that can be explored for medicine. So there's a lot of research left to be done, and it creates a very good opportunity for IP development, right, and the exploration of new treatment modalities for a lot of diseases that we seem to still be grappling with because other conventional medicines have not been working optimally. What
diseases currently can be treated by cannabis?
Okay, so let's start off by just identifying the fact that the US FDA, which is the drug regulatory body in the US, there are 4 formulations, right, for medical cannabis that have been approved by the US FDA. And I did mention that quite a number of these formulations are indeed synthetic products. Yes, there are 3 synthetic and 1 which is naturally extracted. So let's start with the naturally extracted. So that is your extracted CBD oil, right? Cannabidiol oil, which is marketed as Epidiolex, which is used to treat epileptic syndromes in infants, right? 2 years and older, right? You also have a synthetic THC-based products, nabilone, dronabinol, right, which are marketed in the other 3 formulations, which are used for either appetite stimulation in HIV patients, also used for wasting syndrome in cancer patients, also used for nausea and vomiting, right, in persons who are using cancer chemotherapy, right? So with that said, there's already a body of knowledge which has been accepted, right, by the US FDA that cannabinoids do work. In fact, because I'm a scientist and a pharmacologist, I do appreciate that we also have an endocannabinoid system, and our bodies do produce endocannabinoids, which essentially have effects which are associated quite well with these marketed indications for these drugs. Right.
You mentioned the endocannabinoid system that we have, how does our body how do our bodies process the cannabinoid?
So the endocannabinoid system, as the name suggests, it's a system that, like most medical or pharmacological centers in the body, would have drug targets, which are called cannabinoid receptors. There are two types of receptors, CB1, CB2 receptor. Right? There are endocannabinoids that actually bind to these receptors. Most popular endocannabinoid, which is known as anandamide. There's also 2-arachidonyl glycerol, right? And these endocannabinoids, they bind to these receptors. Anandamide has been quite similarly to THC, is known as a agonist, right, when it binds to the CB1 receptor. In different parts of the body, between neural tissue or the brain, can either lead to neurotransmitter release, right, or inhibition of neurotransmitters. And essentially, the effects associated, the normal physiological effects associated with cannabis, or even these endocannabinoids making contact with the cannabinoid receptors, are all linked to these neurotransmitters being released or inhibited. I must point out, apart from cannabinoid receptors, that there are other known targets, pharmacological targets for cannabinoids, which are currently under research and currently being explored, because the more we learn about the endocannabinoid system, we are realizing that its effects might not be limited, right, to the release or inhibition of these neurotransmitters. But there are other signal transduction mechanisms that are being explored, which may indicate, the movement of ions across cell membranes, which also could affect other physiological functions, which are important in our understanding of the overall system. Right?
The cannabinoid system, is it kind of like any other aspect of a human in terms of the older you are, the more mature it is, the younger you are, the less mature it is? Is that a concern that someone should consider if they're thinking about treatment for their 2-year-old or their 3-year-old?
Mm-hmm. So good point. Most of our biological systems, especially when you're young, they are not well developed, but as time progresses, they get more developed. And of course, when you listen to all the guidelines about the use of cannabis-related products, recreational or medicinal, you realize that there are certain age thresholds, right, established. One of the popular one is that for medical or recreational, there is no recommendation which supports the use of cannabis, right, unless it is a clear-cut medical indication or decision by a physician for someone below the age of 18 to actually use especially THC-based cannabinoid products, right? The endocannabinoid system, as I described earlier, it is predominantly concentrated within the central nervous system, but you also find specific receptors like the CB2 receptors at peripheral sites, right? So with that said, there's a concern that because the endocannabinoid system plays an important role in the neurological processes in the brain and neural tissue, that taking or being exposed to cannabis too early could impact brain development, right, and other important brain functions, right? So like most of the scientific sources out there, I also support regulation, right, of access to cannabis-based products, and regulations which speak specifically to age threshold, right, and justifying on a clinical justification for access to cannabinoid products beyond that age threshold, right? Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, seeing that we have an endocannabinoid system, would you say that cannabis is a gateway drug?
The evidence doesn't point to that, and what I mean by that, there are specific references that I'm sure viewers or persons in the public can ascribe to, which will show that if you're to look at it scientifically, persons who were exposed to cannabis, right, who are probably early users, recreationally, medical users, that there's not clear-cut evidence to show that these persons actually, or majority of these persons, progress onto using other substances, right? I think what has happened, unfortunately, again, because of media sensationalism, right, or the persons who are spreading negative propaganda, they have actually looked at a sample of persons who were using hard substances, right? I'm labeling cannabis as a soft substance, right, of abuse. We're using hard substances like coke, cocaine, methamphetamines, and they actually then, looked at what other substances these persons were exposed to prior, right? Which, and in some cases, are in, our significant margin of cases may actually say that some of these persons who use these harder substances may have used cannabis. But the research should have started from the cannabis users and see what percentage of these cannabis users actually moved on to harder substances, where you will see that there's a clear inverse relationship, right, in terms of cannabis use, or starting with cannabis use, moving on to harder substances, right? Yeah.
So you've mentioned propaganda research or information. What are you, or what is UE doing in terms of research on the cannabis plant in general for the Caribbean?
Well, with the rollout of the industry, there's a greater sense of comfort by myself as a researcher, right, and the governance structure of the university to further explore, cannabis under this legal framework. As you know, in 2015, at the Mona campus, right, where the necessary laws were amended, there was a great number of interests and research initiatives that were launched, and that was done under the legal framework. In fact, some of the researchers in Jamaica were a part of that process of, getting the country to move towards that legal reform. Here in Barbados, I expect to see the same, where we'll be able to transition our research from purely theoretical, right, bench research, that we have done, I've participated in with other researchers like Dr. Alana Griffith, also with, Jeremy Stevens, right, where we have looked at, social consequences of substance abuse, specifically marijuana or cannabis, right, known as marijuana within that abuse paradigm. We have also looked at the economics. We have actually proposed a policy framework for the rollout of medicinal cannabis in Barbados. And these are all works which have been published without us getting access to the material and using it directly, which would be against the law. So with law reform, which would then set the framework or platform for, R&D, there would be a lot more opportunities for myself and some of my postgrad students to actually do hands-on research with cannabis. I have 5 postgrad students currently, and 3 of them are ascribed to cannabis-related projects, where they will be required to handle the material. So under the legal framework, or under the appropriate legal framework, those research initiatives will be able to be launched in a more active state. Right.
What are some of the research, what some of the studies do you are currently benched, and do you see yourself getting into?
Well, we have an interest in exploring the anti-epileptic properties of not only CBD, but we also want to look at combinations of CBD, THC. We also want to look at other cannabinoids, right? To explore that Entourage Effect. So one project is focusing on the Entourage Effect on epilepsy, especially temporal lobe epilepsy. And that will be done in a mice model. That is a collaborative research with the University of Glasgow, the Institute of Molecular Cell and Systems Biology. All right, Professor Andrew Tobin is my collaborating PI on that project. I have a student that is looking at type 2 diabetes, which is very, very much prevalent in Caribbean society. And we want to explore CBD, but there might be a role for THC in lowering blood sugar. One of the important effects that THC has is that it stimulates your appetite. So we want to look at that whole hypoglycemic appetite stimulation process mechanism to see if there's any intervention or medical intervention that could be born out of that, which could be used in the treatment of type 2 diabetes. And then last but not least, we also want to look at hypertension, right? We want to explore the protective effect, right? Because CBD is said to be anti-inflammatory. We want to explore the anti-inflammatory effect of CBD on maintaining the integrity of our blood vessels, right? Which could help in diminishing the elevation of blood pressure, right? So those are the 3 areas.
How did you decide to come up with those 3 areas of study? Was it general Barbadian interest, carbon interest? Where did it come from?
Well, I mean, most of our research projects, I mean, the essence of creating a research project requires a certain level of thought, or I guess the theoretical framework before you get to the conceptual framework of the research project, which will require, one, you have to read the literature widely initially to understand what is out there, where are the gaps, and then try to identify those research gaps. But because of the scarcity of resources in the Caribbean, we have to have a much more careful process. We have to make sure that what we research is actually health priorities of the Caribbean. So epilepsy is a global health priority because there are very few drugs that are out there that are considered to be efficacious and safe as anti-epileptic drugs. So we would like to explore CBD and the entourage effect on epilepsy because we do have people who suffer from epilepsy, right, or seizures, within the Caribbean setting. There's also an interest in exploring diabetes because that is clearly, a priority within the region. In Barbados, obesity and diabetes have, the highest prevalence among other conditions, right, that exists within our local population. The same could be said about Jamaica, the same could be said about other Caribbean territories. And hypertension, right, again, extremely prevalent within our population, but not only within our population, but persons that look like us, persons who are African, descendants. We tend to bear specific forms of hypertension more so than other ethnic groups, and part of the issue that we suffer from is salt sensitivity, which also links to poor vascular reactivity. And that vascular reactivity, of course, is because of the inflammation in the vessels. And if we can identify anti-inflammatory effect in the vessels by these cannabinoids, there's an opportunity where, again, another medicine from cannabis could then be used to treat hypertension going forward. Mm-hmm.
We spoke to Ashley Brown, who is a female patient advocate, and she kind of told us what her own anecdotal research, I would say, findings, is that for her use of cannabis during different times of the month, she is assuming that based on her hormonal levels, the effect is different. In terms of research on how our hormones, not just female hormones, affects the intake of cannabis, or the, what is the word I want to use? How our bodies absorb it. Is that something that you will be looking at in terms of issues that affect women? So
there are gender-specific issues, and I'm glad you raised those, because I think that has been lost in the discussion in terms of cannabis as a drug, right? As you know, our bodies are different between male and female, and because of these differences, which stem from genetics, they clearly manifest themselves in how we actually react or deal with specific life circumstances like illness, disease, treatment, right? The pharmacokinetics of cannabis has clearly shown data where the inhalation of cannabis can be proven to be beneficial in terms of onset of action, which is rapid, right? Also speaks to the duration of action, especially if you don't want those effects to be long-lasting, right? Over oral consumption, right, of cannabis-related products. And that is important because on a gender basis, there might be specific conditions which are considered more acute or acute, say, in females versus males, right? You know, on a monthly basis, ladies, you know, undergo their menstrual cycle. We know that some women do suffer from extreme pain associated with their menstrual cycle, dysmenorrhea. There's a likelihood that the analgesic effects of cannabinoids could be beneficial in managing such conditions. There are other cyclic conditions or cyclic pain conditions that the use of cannabis could be used to treat. And these are acute cyclic conditions. When I say acute symptoms, acute pain, right? Now, if you take cannabis orally and the effects only kick in half an hour after taking cannabis, and the effects that kick in may not necessarily meet the required therapeutic effect to nullify that pain, right? We're speaking about some level of sufferation which still be extended to the persons who are using the medical cannabis products. In terms of our views on smoking inhalation, most recently we know that the CDC has put out evidence to say that vaping has become problematic. But again, I found that within that evidence that the CDC had put out, there was no clear-cut evidence to say that the adverse effects reported were related specifically to the inhalation or the vaping of cannabis, right? It was mixed with e-cigarettes, tobacco, and everything. And I think that news like that, when it's not clear to the public, can then misconstrue within persons' minds about specific treatment modalities and how the product can be administered. Because if we were to accept what the CDC said without doing our own research of the evidence to come up with a proper inference overall, we could be putting women, right, at risk for enduring cyclic pain episodes because of, you know, how their bodies are designed naturally, right? More so than men who don't have to deal with that issue on a monthly basis, right? So that is just an example of, you know, when we speak about the gender issues of the use of cannabis, that is a real discussion, and we really have to look at it in a very fair and transparent way about how we, you know, set guidelines and regulations about how to use cannabis for medical purposes, and to ensure that some of the regulations that we put in place are not barriers, right, to groups of your demographic or marginalized groups who could benefit from using cannabis in a specific way.
Speaking of barriers and marginalized groups, let's talk about those who currently cannot afford Western medicine. How do you think, given the way the current framework is being shaped, or the way it can be shaped, how do you think it can be shaped, yes, so that those people aren't further marginalized in terms of having access to treatment that perhaps is the only treatment that's possible for them, or that's palatable for them?
So there are a couple of things to consider, and the first thing, you know, it always starts with understanding what, you know, is the global consensus on the use of cannabis. And the global consensus is the consensus of what the UN conventions of 1961 and 71 speaks to the use of cannabis for medicinal and scientific purposes. So that's one, right? Now, any country or any nation that then wishes to explore a medical or a medicinal cannabis industry, they have to ensure that they have very fair and transparent mechanisms to allow for access, right? Or any other derived benefits out of that industry to be spread among the masses. So systems must be put in place, right? And if you look at the medical cannabis industry as a value chain from cultivation back to end user, a person who is ill should not feel marginalized, or should not feel, because they have a particular religious faith, that if they are to access medical cannabis, then they will be marginalized and further stereotyped to say that, you know, they are only keen on it because they want to use it not for the medicinal benefits, but for a recreational or even the sacramental use of the actual product. just the same way at the level of cultivation, where the value chain starts, where not because someone is of a particular religious faith, that person should be marginalized to say that they can't get a cultivation license because, they are not going to cultivate for the medicinal cannabis industry. They're going to cultivate because they want to use it recreationally or for sacramental purposes. So we need to ensure that there are very clear-cut, fair, transparent mechanisms in place which will ensure, right, that no group, because of how they look, their religious belief, right, their gender, continue to be marginalized based on the systems that are put in place to administer the industry.
Okay, I'm going to ask a somewhat controversial question now. We spoke about marginalization. I meant general.
Right.
You sort of tailored it to a specific group.
Right.
Do you think that religious group have been or are more discriminated against as opposed to others that may look like them but do not belong to that same group? Do you understand what I'm asking?
So if and you could correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying
okay, so let me ask in plain terms.
Yes.
Right? And be less diplomatic.
Correct.
So someone who's a Rastafarian or of that religious or lifestyle group, would you say that they are more marginalized or have been more marginalized than someone who looked like them, i.e. skin color, nappy hair, may not be locked?
Right.
Do you think that there's a difference in terms of discrimination?
I would be completely ignorant if I was to say no. If my answer to your question is no. Yes, Rastafarians have been marginalized, not only marginalized because of cannabis, but they have been marginalized based on their belief, right, by other religious groups, other religions, Christianity, among others, even though we speak about inclusivity and love within the space of religion. But yes, certainly for the use of cannabis as a sacrament, they have also been marginalized because it is common, but I don't think we're there yet where we understand the importance of, the whole need for sacramental practices within religions. In Christianity, in the Anglican faith, you take a communion. You also take a communion in Catholicism, right? The communion in Christian faith may not necessarily be of a controlled substance, and I think that is where the argument gets a little bit dicey. So all religious groups, should have, do have a human right and should have what we consider the right to practice their religion within a space of freedom, right? Which is not predetermined by any other law apart from, international conventions which speaks about religious rights. But yet still we have a situation where, because of the legality of a substance which is being identified as a sacrament, those rights have somewhat been infringed. But it's a difficult discussion, and let me tell you the difficulty in the discussion. We have 2 UN conventions that speak to 2 different subject matter. We have a UN convention which speaks about controlled substances, cannabis is one, and then we have a UN convention which speaks about a freedom of religious practices, right, and human rights. So you have 2 conventions which are cross-talking. So I believe, to resolve the situation going forward, that what we should really have is some form of consultation at the level of the United Nations, where some level of common sense is brought forward to the discussion about how do we rationalize these 2 conventions to ensure that persons who are of right practicing their faith as a Rastafarian are allowed to undertake their sacrament, right? A lot of persons have said that, we at the national level could have that discussion and make provisions in place. But at the same time, for a small developing state, like we all are in the Caribbean, from Jamaica, come all the way back to Barbados, right? I understand that our governments, right, that they are concerned that, if they start to have that discussion at a local level without getting that sort of international consultation, there will be great trepidation in the forms of potential fallouts, diplomatic fallouts with other countries, larger countries who are a part of the UN consortium, who may feel as if, we have not honored the treaty that we have signed to, right? So I think it's a discussion that is worth having because there should be no group at all that should feel marginalized in terms of the provisions that are put in place to allow for the use of any substance or the practice of any right that has been mandated via these international treaties. Mm-hmm.
All right. Okay. So my next one is this. Mm-hmm. Rastafarianism or Rastafarians aren't the only people that use cannabis.
That's true.
For
religious purposes.
Religious purposes, and that's in the Caribbean, right? Hindus use it also.
That's right, and the persons of the Baha'i faith, right? Yes.
Right. Mm-hmm. So my next question is this: is the issue really cannabis use for religious purposes by Rastafarians, or is the issue cannabis use for religious purposes in general? And do you think that if the other religious groups were to come together and make their stance as vocal as the Rastafarians, if the response would be the same?
So, well, let me start off by saying that I think that our government, even though the Rastafarians may share a different view, and I'm not speaking on behalf of government, but I believe that our governments have been quite open to the discussion, right? I can't say that I've been a part of any more recent forum with this current administration where the Rastafarians have not been brought to the discussion table to outline their views, and they have made this view very clear. But I do believe in strength in numbers, right? And even though we have about 4,000 Rastafarians or practicing Rastafarians in Barbados, those were the numbers quoted by one of the Rastafarian groups that would have contributed to the Joint Select Committee. I believe that if the Rastafarians were to come together, speak from one voice, and also have other religious groups who use cannabis as a part of their sacrament, join with the Rastafarians to come again to speak from one voice, I think that we would be able to create a very important voice, right, that can transmit not only through our government, but also to the bearers of the international treaties, the United Nations, for some consideration. Rastafarians started in the Caribbean, right? So I think the Caribbean needs to lead with this. And I think one could assume that there are more persons of the Baha'i faith and more persons of who believe in other religious movements such as Hindu. While they may exist in the Caribbean, you might find a higher number of them in other parts of the Caribbean. But we're talking about the legalization of the use of a controlled substance in the Caribbean. So I think it is the persons who are in the Caribbean who need to come together to speak about what is happening within the Caribbean region. But I believe if all voices were to join as one, strength in numbers, I think that itself would create an opportunity for further discourse. I also believe that going forward, that this notion that there can only be two uses of cannabis, one being recreational and one being medicinal, that we have to start, dispersing that view. What I mean by that is I can foresee, similar to what may have transpired in Canada, but not as relaxed as Canada, but I could see where cannabis itself could be regulated, right, for specific purposes, not necessarily medicinal purposes only, but for, say, adult use, right? When I say adult use, clearly by persons who are 18 and over, and it may be for sacramental purposes, it may be for individuals who may want some relaxation in a safe environment. When I say safe, I'm speaking about ensuring that the use of cannabis will not endanger their lives or other people's lives, but within their private entity, they can use it for relaxation purposes. And I believe it can be regulated. I can believe that a certain amount of cannabis can be held by persons once it is used in a safe and confined area. And that is where I would like the discussion to progress to after medicinal cannabis has been established. right? Because medicinal cannabis will create opportunities where we can get research data readily available, that we can now understand the safety and efficacy of cannabis, and we should be able to speak a lot more to the safety concerns that some conservative pockets of the society may have on any legalization of cannabis outside of medicinal.
You spoke of Canada. I know the question was raised quite recently. Are you saying that based on perhaps some business interests you have with Canadians?
Well, Canada is always referenced in cannabis discussions, because, you know, Canada has had for roughly 18 to 19 years, roughly 18 years, medicinal cannabis, right? And then most recently they went to full legalization in 2018, right? For the Caribbean, I may not be of the view that full legalization is required, right? But I believe that for adult use, which may have specific forms, as I spoke about sacramental, I spoke about the issue of, you know, private use within a safe, confined environment. I believe that those are areas that we could be somewhat tolerant of going forward. But Canada was mentioned because, you know, we benchmark some of our practices from Canada. We know that they have a very clear-cut system which is regulated through their government health network, Health Canada, which has been working fairly well. Right? But I could imagine for Barbados and other Caribbean territories, because Canada has legalized cannabis at that national level, it creates an opportunity for us to explore business relations in terms of medicinal cannabis, right, and not recreational.